Well, good morning. I think we can get started. My name is Scott Smith. I'm the Director for Afghanistan and Central Asia programs here at USIP. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. Now that you're here, I should say that there's maybe one slight problem with the topic that we're going to deal with today. And the problem is it even too premature to speak about Karzai's legacy? After all, I think yesterday we began, or in Kabul they began, an audit of these 8 million votes, according to a deal that Secretary Kerry brokered last week. It will be a complicated audit. I would not be surprised, having gone through something similar myself with Ambassador Eide, that it may be longer than expected. And I imagine that, to a certain degree, the question that we're going to talk about today, President Karzai's legacy, will also be affected by how this election comes to an end. Nonetheless, I think we all still have a great deal to say. President Karzai has been leading Afghanistan in one way or the other for the last 13 years, since December 2001. And we thought here at USIP that it was an appropriate moment, while the election is being worked out, to take stock of what has been accomplished in that time. And by that, I mean not only the state of the country that he'll leave for the next president, but also certain habits of governing that he has adopted and that have become the model, to a certain extent, for an entire generation of young people who have grown up during that time. One of the questions I imagine we'll look at is, was this the only way of governing? And another issue, of course, is the relationship he leaves behind with the international community, and the U.S. in particular, which will have a significant effect, I think, over Afghanistan's development and progress in the next 5 to 10 years, if not longer. The other tricky thing about the topic is that it's Karzai's legacy, not necessarily Karzai himself. But I have a feeling that it will be difficult in the discussion to separate the man from the legacy. In my own thinking about this, it seems to me that from a point of view of U.S. foreign policy, if not the foreign policy of the international community in general, it's been difficult to have an Afghanistan policy, and we've often more had a policy towards President Karzai, which means that the tools and the terms in which we've discussed this policy have been more sort of psychological almost than diplomatic. You know, what is President Karzai thinking? How can we convince him to do this or to do that? Has President Karzai, lost his mind? These have all been features of the discourse about this president over the last 13 years. And it's a testament, I think, in part to the fact that obviously constitutionally the president has immense powers, which means that he is obviously the most important person in the country to deal with. But I think it's also a testament to the sort of, almost Shakespearean complexity of his leadership and his personality. So with that, our panelists, I assume, are here neither to praise nor to bury him, but to try to give us an accurate assessment of the country he's leaving behind, what the challenges were, what he has achieved, what he might have achieved, and how really enduring is this legacy. How much has the Afghanistan that he's created, in large part over the last 13 years, become a permanent part of Afghanistan's sort of new DNA, or whether there will be aspects of it that can be changed by the next administration, whoever will emerge from this count. So it's a complex topic, but I think we have an excellent panel for it. Mujib Mashal is a young Afghan journalist who's just published 2 excellent articles on President Karzai, including one recently in The Atlantic that introduces this topic really of his legacy, which is, I have it here, The Men Who Ran Afghanistan, which if you haven't read it is definitely worth a read. General Allen, who is a commander of NATO and ISAF forces in Afghanistan in 2011 and 2013, a crucial time during the transition to the Afghan lead for combat operations in Afghanistan, and has obviously dealt closely with President Karzai across the spectrum of issues relating to that military relationship and inevitably, in part, the political relationship. Finally, Ambassador Kai Eide, who was the Special Representative, the Secretary General of the UN in Afghanistan between 2008 and 2010, during obviously the 2009 election that I mentioned earlier. And while I will try to be an impartial moderator, I suppose I should disclose that I also worked with Kai during that period. So that does not mean that I will not challenge him on some points that he may raise. So what I'll ask the panelists to speak in the following order. Well, Kai, General Allen, Mujib to speak for about 10 or 15 minutes. I may have a few reactions, and then we'll open it up to you for questions. So with that, Kai, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Scott, and thanks to the USIP for organizing this. There have been many events here over the year I spent in Washington, and I always enjoy them very, very much. I have to disclose also that I worked with him, but I hope he will not be too critical today. Let me go back to two statements made by Karzai when I talked to him in May this year. One was looking back at 2002, when he had just been installed as chairman of the interim authority. He said, it was really a euphoric atmosphere. I believe that the international community would come in and help clean the house and then hand it over to the owner in good shape. That was his thinking at the time. And then he says about his thinking 13 years later, I see Afghanistan as a two-story house where the tenant upstairs does not interfere with the owner and how he organizes the house. The tenant is welcome to stay. The tenant is welcome to stay. The tenant here being the United States. But the owner has to organize the house. And sometimes, he said, the international community has treated some Afghans as insects. That's a dramatic statement. And then you wonder what has happened in between this euphoric statement of 2012 and this bitterness that comes through in 2014. Today, Karzai is seen as deeply critical of the United States. I believe that's unfair, in fact. I don't think he is. He's critical of certain actions that has been undertaken or certain policies that have been pursued, but not of the US in itself, and I will come back to that. Now, why did we come to treat him the way we did? In my view, because of a profound misunderstanding of the Afghan society, and Bob Gates in his book says also that it's astonishing after 20 years we've learned nothing about the Afghan society. And then also a misunderstanding of Karzai as an Afghan leader. Because when you meet him, he's not like the other traditional Afghan leaders. But nor is he like the leaders who have spent decades abroad, received their education abroad, etc. He is there somewhere in between. It seems as it's very easy to think, here is a Western-oriented leader dressed in Afghan clothes. And is far from the truth. President Karzai is Afghan to the core. He's an Afghan political leader. And he lives in two worlds at the same time. He lives in the old Afghan political context with its culture and traditions. And he lives in the new world of institutions established after the fall of the Taliban. And where does he feel most at ease? I think he by far feels most at ease in the old traditional Afghan world, because that's his world. That is the world in which he grew up. And we tend to not understand that, unfortunately. We're discussing his legacy with him, in fact, in May. I asked him, how do you see your legacy? He didn't want to respond. So he pushed the question right back to me and he said, how do you see my legacy? Can I answer? Well, Mr. President, first of all, I see you as the consensus builder. And he said, yes, the consensus builder. I very much wanted to be the consensus builder. And I said, well, Mr. President, but that's not the easiest way of bringing a country from A to B. And he said, how do you define democracy? My answer was, democracy is ruled by majority. No, 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 no. That's impossible in this country. In this country, democracy must mean rule by consensus. If you apply rule by majority, this country will go through conflict and fragmentation. And I think he is quite right. And I must say, there's no other Afghan leader that I have met who understands his society and its complexity more than he does. And even when I was there in 2010 and later, Afghan leaders who had spent much of their time abroad came and said to me, look, I admit now that he understood the situation much better than we did. He understood the reactions in the communities in the south and the east, etc. Much better than we did. And I remember so well the one prominent minister who traveled with the president to the south, and then he sent me an SMS which read, now I am in the real Afghanistan. What did he mean to me? He was a person who had spent much of his life abroad, and he discovered Afghanistan. And I think Mujib also has experienced, and he describes in his articles, how he meets with the elders and the mullahs during Friday after prayer for lunch and discusses so many things. It's a very relaxed discussion. And you wonder sometimes, of course I didn't understand, and Mujib does understand what was being said, but I remember myself leaving the meetings and that thinking, what was this about? And it was about showing respect, enabling these leaders to go back to their communities and say, the president showed us respect. In that sense, I think he is a master politician, and certainly the politician who knows the country best. And then, so Karzai, the consensus builder, tremendously important at this juncture for keeping the country together. And then Karzai, the reformer. And I must say, from 2002 to 2014, the country has been through a tremendous transformation. Sometimes we overdo it a little bit and we become a bit propagandistic in the way we use figures and so on. It's not as easy as we sometimes pretend. But there has been tremendous progress. And you cannot say that the man who has presided over this is not an important part of that process. He is. And I think since we have Mujib here, I will also ask him about this. The media, for instance. You are today in Afghanistan in a situation where the media society is more vibrant, more open, more questions are being discussed over and over again than in any other country in the wider region. Any other country in the wider region. Not only with male journalists, but female journalists. And I remember one press conference with the president in his palace where one female journalist comes, raises her hand and asks him a very provocative question about corruption. That would not have happened a few years ago. So there is an important change. He is also the reformer. Did he manage to become Karzai the peacemaker as he wanted? Unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. In spite of all his efforts and in spite of wishing that so much. And then we come to what you mentioned, Scott, the elections. But I must say, so far, all the rumors we've heard, he wanted to change the constitution to stay on. He wanted to put in a weak president for 4 years so he could return. He wanted to create a chaotic situation so that he could declare a state of emergency and hang on to the presidency. Nothing of that has happened. I believe Karzai is a person who intends to leave, has intended to leave throughout this process, and let's hope that he can finish in peace and without any further confrontation. Just one more minute, if I may, Scott.
Take your time.
There is a tendency to see him as anti-US, or very critical of the US. Now I'll tell you one story. In 2009, just before the inauguration of the president for his second term, I gave a press conference, and I criticized the warlords, and I criticized the corruption, and I said I really believe that a future peaceful structure of the region has to mean that Afghanistan goes back to some sort of neutral status. Karzai became very angry and reacted publicly. Most of the media believed that it was because of what I said about warlords and corruption. Not at all. He had heard that from me before, he knew. I had 6 meetings with him trying to prevent him from appointing Fahim Khan as candidate to the vice presidency. He knew all that. What did he react to? I had, without consulting him, touched upon the most fundamental aspect of a country's status and future. A country's future, its status. I had said neutral without asking him. And he called me up to his office and said, I don't want it to be a neutral country. I want this country to be a close, non-NATO US ally. And he repeated that in his inauguration speech a few weeks later. What did it mean? In spite of the humiliation he had gone through during the Obama administration, with Richard Holbrooke trying to get rid of him, confirmed by Bob Gates in his book, in spite of that, in spite of feeling that he was neglected, in spite of feeling that he was not consulted, he said that that relationship is critical to me. His second term became, or his last term as president, became one long effort at restoring Afghan sovereignty. And I believe he was right, because sovereignty and respect for a country's sovereignty is a precondition for its return to normalcy. I think he has also done a tremendous effort in trying to restore that sovereignty. And it will, of course, be up to his successors to choose if they will follow that course or if they will find another. But I do believe that he has laid the framework for moving forward on a solid ground. So in that respect, I do see President Karzai as a historic leader who managed to keep the country together, who managed to preside over a period of historic reform, and who then rightly insisted on respect for his country as a proud, albeit poor and war-torn country. Thank you.
Thanks, Kai. Well, General Adler.
Well, Scott, thanks very much for the invitation to be here this morning. It's always great to be at USIP. These are important sessions, and I would say that important to any gathering like this would be probably at the beginning to take a moment to talk about why this gathering is important. This isn't about Karzai per se, I think, in many respects. It is, I believe, a role of an institution like this, in forums like this, to talk about how we can learn from this kind of a gathering, the challenges that leaders like President Karzai are not only facing in his own country today, but his successor will face, and in other countries similar to the situation that we find in Afghanistan. I think it's also important, another outcome of a session like this, for us to hold the mirror up and to look into that mirror both as a people and as a country, and to decide whether we can stand the reflection that we see. And then finally, a gathering like this ought to help us to inform the policy processes of the United States in particular, for not just our current relationship with Afghanistan and other states in contemporary situations like this, but our policy processes for the future. So in that regard, Scott, thanks very much for convening this group and for USIP for putting this on. And let me start by saying, with the bottom line up front, which is I think what you'd expect from a Marine, I believe that the historical legacy of President Karzai is going to be far kinder to him than many of the contemporary opinions are that are expressed routinely about him today. And all of us on this panel were selected to comment or to offer our perspectives on what I believe to be an extraordinarily important individual and a very complex man. With that in mind, we're probably going to agree on some issues and we're going to disagree on other issues, but I don't think that means that any of us or all of us are wrong. It is because when one regards Hamid Karzai and his times and the complexity of the environment in which he has had to operate and the challenges that he's had to face, it defies a simple distillation on the man or the circumstances. So I took my role on this panel to be one of providing the perspective of a military commander, the ISAF commander, on President Karzai. And I remember well our worrying about my first meeting with him. We spent a lot of time actually preparing for that meeting. It would define our relationship in many respects and would follow on what had been widely considered to be a strained relationship with General Petraeus. It was mid-July in 2011, and I was the fourth ISAF commander in 3 years that President Karzai was going to have to deal with. And in and of itself, that was a source of self-inflicted friction on the Allied and the Western side. Turned out the meeting was a pretty friendly meeting, and it was an opportunity for us to establish what I believe to this day is a friendship. I pledged him my support and my full energy in our partnership for the future. But not surprisingly, afterward I was amused and a bit alarmed at the palace press release of our first meeting and the many things that I had conceded to him in a meeting which, had I actually done that, would probably have taken a couple of days. But nonetheless, we were able to get some work done. It established a standard, I think, for a good relationship in the future. And when I called my dear friend, the U.S. Ambassador Ryan Crocker, to point out what I thought was a process foul on this first meeting and the press release, he just laughed and welcomed me to Afghanistan. So this began a relationship that would span my 18 months of command, and where I would see him at least once a week and often frequently. And I sought to make this relationship something more than casual. I sought to make this relationship productive, but I also considered the relationship a friendship, because he's really a very charming, charismatic individual. He's extraordinarily well-read. He once loaned me one of his books and said, "Would you take a look at this and give me your thoughts on it?" And a month later, you know, Marines take a while to get books read. A month later, he asked me where his book was. And I brought him his book and a copy for me, which I asked him to inscribe, and we had a wonderful conversation on the Anglo-Afghan wars. He knew us far better than we understood him and the ancient culture of the Pashtuns and the other tribes and the ethnicities of Afghanistan. And in this, we were at a distinct disadvantage. Or put differently, he was at a distinct advantage in his leadership. And I often told people that you could make a fundamental error in your relationship with President Karzai by assuming that he is inherently a Westphalian president in the context of a European leader. He is, in fact, a tribal leader. He is, in fact, of the elite of the tribes. And as Kai, I think, properly said, many of those hardwired paradigms were the first lenses through which he would view the challenges that we faced and the crises that we would ultimately have to solve. And none of that's wrong. And it shouldn't be alarming, and it shouldn't necessarily be surprising. It came from the inherent responsibility that we all had to understand the environment in which we were operating as military professionals, and ultimately to understand the inherent nature of this leader with whom we would deal. He always was happiest when he was relating the details of Afghan history. He was, I think, not just an Afghan nationalist in that sense. I think he was an Afghan patriot in that regard. And sometimes he would be seemingly rambling from one topic to another, and I would sit there wondering where all this is going. But invariably, he'd bring it all back to the present, and he would tie it all together very skillfully to address whatever issue or crisis we faced, and would then use the very clear vehicle of Afghan history to make the imperative or to make the point that we needed to solve the problems we were facing today. Let me take you through just a few of the challenges that we faced together, because I think it helps to define how he and I dealt on a day-to-day basis in our interaction. And I'll go through these quickly, but we can certainly come back to them in the question and answer sessions on any one in particular, because each one of these was a substantial lift in our relationship. The first was the negotiation of the Strategic Partnership Agreement. And while Ryan Crocker and I sat at the table shoulder to shoulder for most of the negotiating session, we dealt very closely on this issue. And of course, as you know, as a direct result of the SPA, we ultimately had to go into the negotiating of the bilateral security agreement as well. And in conjunction with the negotiation of the partnership agreement, the strategic agreement, he convened the Loya Jirga. And this goes to, I think, a really important point about the nature of Hamid Karzai as a leader and as a politician. It is that he was masterful in managing and manipulating informal networks. And when I say manipulating, that is by no means intended in a pejorative manner. He understood the people of Afghanistan. He may not have been of their ilk necessarily, a Hazara or a Uzbek or a Tajik, but he certainly understood them and worked very well informally in those networks as a tribal leader would to seek this consensus that I think Kai properly talked about was his intention. He was enormously frustrated with the U.S. over our policy towards Pakistan, and he was convinced that we were fighting the war in the wrong place. This flowed through a number of themes that we dealt with on a regular basis, some of which were, frankly, quite painful, and that was the issue of civilian casualties, frustration over Pakistani safe havens, the Haqqani network, and the cross-border fires in 2012 and early 2013 in Kunar, part of which was a myth and part of which was a reality. We also dealt very closely on the issues of detentions. This goes again to this issue of President Karzai seeking to establish and to reinforce the sense that Afghanistan was a sovereign country and to wrest from the United States and other countries the kinds of respect due to that country and due to its people. And as we negotiated a contentious MOU for my turning over of several thousand Afghan detainees to Afghanistan, that process and that sense of sovereignty came home in a very real way for me. And then, unfortunately, when President Karzai abrogated parts of the MOU, I had to cease the turnover of detainees until such time I was sure that they weren't going to be released ultimately to target us or Afghan citizens or the Afghans again. We also had a period of time where we worked very closely on night operations and special operations, and that resulted in a memorandum of understanding as well, where we sought to move from being unilaterally engaged in night ops, spec ops, to one where we partnered with the Afghans, to one where I committed to him and to the Afghan security leadership the development of special operations capabilities where Afghanistan could eventually operate unilaterally without specific U.S. or NATO help. And then very clearly, it was a time of transition, as Scott properly said. We were moving the Afghan forces from being in trail to being in the lead. We were moving ISAF forces from being in the lead to being advisory. in nature. But very importantly for me, I worked hard, and I know Stan McChrystal had before me, and ultimately Dave Petraeus in succession to him, on trying to understand Hamid Karzai's sense of his ownership of the Afghan National Security Forces as the commander-in-chief, but more importantly, the ownership of the Afghan security forces in the context of the conflict that was being waged. It was never fully clear to me what his attitude was. And then, of course, we dealt very carefully and often on the issue of corruption, me trying to get him to work towards dealing with institutional corruption and him trying to get me to get our spending and our contracting processes under control. And there were a number of other areas like the Afghan local police and the elimination of private security companies and transitioning PRTs where we worked together very closely. But we also faced some world-class crises which were very important in defining how we worked during times of real stress and crisis. And I think that was an area that defined our friendship, and we leveraged that friendship on a number of occasions to get to the solution, or at least to keep the crisis from spinning us off into space. The first was the downing of my CH-47 with an entire SEAL strike force on board within a month of my taking command. That was a moment of great concern for him because he believed that we were beginning to witness that moment on the battlefield, which had been witnessed in Afghanistan when the first Stingers arrived during the Soviet war. And it was a moment of real concern for him. And we worked that very closely together. Then shortly after that, the U.S. Embassy and my headquarters was attacked by suicide bombers. And that was an area where we worked very closely in the solution of that and understanding how that came about. Followed almost immediately, a week later, by the assassination of President Rabbani, the head of the High Peace Council, the chair of the High Peace Council, and all of the associated difficulties with that. Then the Salalah event along the Pakistani border, where 24 Pakistani troops were tragically killed, ultimately resulting in Pakistan closing my principal ground line of communications, over which 80% of my supplies flowed into the country. That was followed, you'll recall, ladies and gentlemen, by the urination video, where U.S. Marines were found to be urinating on dead Taliban. That created a sequence of events in conjunction with the inadvertent and sad burning of the Holy Quran at Bagram, which began the process of the insider attacks, which really stressed the relationship between the West in general, NATO, and the Afghan government and President Karzai, but also stressed the relationship within the coalition itself, as increasingly these insider attacks were eroding the consensus of the coalition to remain committed to Afghanistan. And then that was followed by the mass killing, you'll recall, of the 16 Afghans in Balaambay in Panjwai district in Kandahar. And each of these, whether it was a challenge or a crisis, permitted me to take the measure of the man. And I found President Karzai to be a worthy partner in most of these. We didn't agree necessarily on many of them. And often the outcome wasn't what either of us desired. But these were moments where we had the opportunity to work very closely. So against the backdrop of these many factors, I think it's important to take stock of President Karzai's legacy under these many strains. He has very strong opinions, for example, on the sources of corruption in Afghanistan. He blames foreign influences significantly, and the United States in particular, but was unable or unwilling to take credible and decisive action to curb the corruption within the country. He remembers the U.S. role in the shaping of the 2009 election, which caused a lot of animosity and antipathy towards the United States, I believe, while avoiding at the same time the matter of substantial ballot box stuffing. He was enormously critical of the U.S. policy towards Pakistan, but did not exert every effort to reach out to Pakistan to improve that relationship. And he would accuse the U.S. of arrogance and malfeasance, demonstrating in the process his mastery of something else called brinksmanship. But at the same time he was confronting this, we also had to keep in mind as Americans, and I heard this first from Dave Petraeus, and I tested it myself when I was there, that many of these crises that we had with President Karzai could easily have been solved if we had listened closely to him 1 or 2 or 3 years before, when he'd raised the issue early along in the process, and we were either deaf to the issue that he was raising, or we under-resourced the solution and ultimately didn't really solve the problem. And so issues about, for example, the private security companies, that was a real issue to him, and it was a real issue to Afghans. And we didn't solve it properly. He ultimately brought us to the brink, and the creation of the Afghan Public Protection Force was the result. Not the perfect solution, but it was a solution. And the elimination, ultimately, of provincial reconstruction teams, in terms of rendering them as capacity-building mechanisms rather than service provider mechanisms, which compromise the ability of local governance to develop. And then ultimately, civilian contracting, civilian casualties, and corruption. These were all issues where, if we'd listened to him earlier and we'd taken the kinds of actions that he believed we should have, he often provided us excellent advice in that regard, this could have reduced, I think, friction in many respects on many issues. Now, legacies take many shapes and invariably are formed in the eyes of the beholders. I'm going to take a crack at some of this, and I want to be careful because it's difficult, even before he's out of office, to talk about his historic legacy. And that's why a panel like this is valuable, I think, in terms of how we look at the future and for policy processes. But I think it's fraught with dangers in terms of the potential for criticizing a sitting president. I'll leave to the Afghans, and I suspect I'll hear a bit in a moment from a very prominent Afghan journalist, how they view their president. But from the many, many Afghans with whom I've dealt, and I've never asked an Afghan his or her opinion of their president, because I believed, out of respect to the president and respect to the Afghans, I didn't want to put them in that place. It doesn't mean they didn't offer their opinions. And I always had a sense of their open, but sometimes grudging respect for him. They respected Hamid Karzai. But there was also a sense of melancholy, I believe, on the absence of his presence and that of his governance in their lives. And I'm talking about subnational governance, which we worked so hard to try to develop, but it defied my abilities when I was there as a commander. We can talk about that if you like. But they were very proud of him in many ways. They were proud that he stood up to the foreigners, of which I was one. But recently, I think, as regards the bilateral security agreement, which would enshrine a permanent presence for the foreigners, many Afghans were simply horrified that he seemed to be sacrificing their future in not signing an agreement and never fully explaining why or clearly understanding why. And I think in some respects, in terms of a contemporary legacy, we see that much ground was lost by the president in that regard. Regionally, I believe Pakistan will not view the Karzai era and the relationship between Islamabad and Kabul with much nostalgia. Hamid Karzai's views of Pakistan were seldom positive. Unfortunately, they were frequently openly expressed, which made the relationship difficult to manage. Tehran, I think, will not miss the president either, for many reasons, but I think this goes to Kai's points about President Karzai's journey and personal goals of making Afghanistan a sovereign entity to be reckoned with. And I think that the Iranians ultimately were to determine, even with a substantial presence in Kabul, they had much less influence over the president and over the parliament than they had hoped. And the bilateral security agreement left a foreign presence in the country, which Iran had consistently resisted. NATO, I think, will view him in the short term as an unappreciative partner who over time became increasingly difficult to deal with. While only the president, Hamid Karzai, can say for sure, it is likely that he always viewed the enormity of the 50-nation NATO-led coalition as too intrusive on the sovereignty of Afghanistan and ultimately on his own authority. But I think we may have missed, or he may have missed, the larger point that those 50 nations committed their blood and their treasure to Afghanistan and thus tied irrevocably the international community to the future of this poor and beleaguered country in ways we have probably never seen the parallel before in history. Afghanistan, this poor state, this nation emerging from conflict, whose interests were the personal interests of 50 nations in the world, I think that was a true advantage to Afghanistan. And then there's the U.S., and he's being judged harshly, frankly, in the U.S., perhaps unfairly so, and will be likely for some time. His inflammatory and provocative and sometimes disrespectful rhetoric aimed at this administration, but sadly also aimed at the sacrifices of U.S. troops, was compounded by a sense of his ungratefulness for the U.S. investment. Again, perceptions. And this perception ultimately attracted the ire of much of the Congress and the administration. And taken together, this actually put the U.S. relationship and commitment to Afghanistan in danger. When I was the commander, I did not seriously consider that there was a possible likelihood of a zero option. In essence, the U.S. pulling out completely of Afghanistan and frankly taking with it NATO and the international community. But I have to tell you, over the last probably 6 to 8 months, and in particular with the rhetoric and the problems over the bilateral security agreement, we came perilously close, ultimately, to a zero option. And we still don't have a signed bilateral security agreement, although I suspect that the soon-to-be inaugurated president will do so pretty quickly. And unfortunately, this has tainted his short-term legacy overall, and I believe it will taint it for a considerable period in the United States. But the truth is, Hamid Karzai is a man with extraordinary abilities, but with human frailties. He was placed in one of the most demanding, thankless positions on the planet and was forced to operate within a largely incapable government emerging after a generation of conflict, where he found not only difficulty in managing a national government from the palace, but also in creating the kind of subnational government necessary to extend the writ of Kabul to the people. He had to coexist and operate with the largest wartime coalition in modern era inside his country, while seeking to reconcile with the Taliban and foreign fighters a rebellion and ultimately to bring peace to his people. Few men have, in my mind, ever faced larger challenges for so long with so few real measures and tools to deal with any one of them individually, much less all of them simultaneously. So yes, he was flawed, and yes, he played fast and loose with relationships over time, and yes, he was provocative, and no, he was not demented, and no, he was not on meds. None that I knew of. But in a few weeks' time, when the next president of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan is inaugurated, that new president will lead a nation still seriously challenged with a violent insurgency, but one profoundly changed for the better in the 12 plus nearly 13 years that Hamid Karzai assumed his office in this troubled nation. In that context, while today Hamid Karzai finds himself often strongly criticized, as I said at the beginning, I believe a searching and detailed analysis of his administration and his presidency and of him as a man will return a balanced appraisal of his legacy and how it was that after all these years of conflict, Afghanistan could have come so far under his leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, General Allen. I think there's a huge amount there that we will be able to engage with a little bit later on his legacy. So, Mujib, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Scott. I'm humbled to be part of such a distinguished panel, and I wanted to read a few passages from the article I recently wrote for The Atlantic. It's called After Karzai, and it's in the current issue of The Atlantic magazine. I walked around for an hour this morning trying to find a copy. I couldn't. So it tells you how well I know DC.
It's in everybody's briefcases. They're all reading it at every break.
So I'll read a couple passages, and then I'll have a few remarks about the president's domestic policy, domestic legacy, and his local governance. And in providing the context for this passage, I'll go back to one of the points the general emphasized and how difficult it is to predict a sitting president's legacy and how challenging it is. So here's the passage. The Afghanistan that Karzai leaves behind is certainly a more inclusive and cohesive country than the fractured mess he inherited. Among my own peers, educated young urbanites connected to the world and provided with free space for expression, there's a growing sense of nostalgia for him. He's largely seen as a man of great personal dignity who, despite his shortcomings, tried to minimize the bloodshed that my generation was born into. Our Afghanistan is shaped by principles Karzai saw as essential and non-negotiable. But because of the president's style of leadership, these gains appear tenuous. Under Karzai, a relatively free press blossomed, but every time threats against it emerged, they have been blunted not by the institutions or laws Karzai put in place, but by the president's personal intervention. The same can be said of women's participation in society, which has grown tremendously, but with few institutional safeguards. Even the future role of the country's warlords is uncertain. Karzai has kept most of these men off balance, and he deserves credit for doing so. Yet these men are not gone from public life. They have continued to profit from contracts and investments largely tied to the presence of foreign militaries. Vested economic interest is a major factor that keeps them loyal to the democratic system. Indeed, in 12 and a half years of Karzai's rule, many have sanitized their images, these warlords. Shorter beards, fancier suits, more politically correct language. For better or worse, their sons and daughters, who seem more attuned to democratic practices, are now beginning to step into their father's shoes. Spanta is Karzai's national security advisor. Spanta says he doubts anyone could have fared better than Karzai in such a fragmented society. And yet, the next president of Afghanistan will inherit a broken chain of command, weak institutions, and a variety of local powers that may prove difficult to bring to heel. All the more so because he will lack the personal connections that Karzai works so hard to cultivate. The question whether the forces from the past will succeed again, this is Spanta speaking, the question whether the forces of the past will succeed again, or whether modernizing forces will take the country forward, this has not been finalized. Almost none of the achievements made under Karzai appear irreversible, Spanta lamented. Instead, Afghanistan remains a place stuck between modernity and its own splintered history. Which way it will move next is anyone's guess. So I saw the president about a week after the first round of elections to find a successor to him in April. And it was, the feeling at that time was that he had done a good job staying neutral in the elections. There was a sense of jubilation. About 7 million people had turned out to vote. And Karzai had proved his critics wrong. As Ambassador Eide said, there were a lot of theories, conspiracy theories, that he would change the constitution, he would stay in power. So in April, when I wrote this, all that seemed, false. And the article went to the print, and in the 1 month period until the article came out, a lot changed. So to go back to the difficult nature of predicting Hamid Karzai's legacy. So in that 1 month or one and a half months until the article came out, we had another round of, there was a triangle of conspiracy. Abdullah alleged that there was a triangle of conspiracy trying to steal the election from him, and the triangle was the rival candidate Ashraf Ghani, President Karzai, and the Election Commission. So a lot changed, and I started questioning some of the things that I wrote. But I'm glad that most of the questions that I had discussed in the article deals with his 12 years of leadership and his, particularly his style of local governance. And I'd like to make a few remarks about that and what sort of legacy he leaves behind. I think at the end of the day, the legacy that matters is the legacy on the ground. Yes, the relationship with NATO, yes, the relationship with the United States will matter, and it'll be questioned history, but what he leaves behind on the ground, especially to my generation, a generation that sort of is a product of his 13 years, will matter a lot. So if we go back to the sense of euphoria that Ambassador Eide mentioned about 2002, when Hamid Karzai came to power, there was an enormous responsibility, an enormous mandate to build institutions. Afghanistan was pretty fractured over 3 decades of war, and even the palace that Karzai came to in Kabul, I remember during the Taliban days, people could take a shortcut through that palace if they were going from one end of the city to the other. There were no institutions. People, shepherds could bring their herds to that palace to graze on the... Fortunately, the president of local government developed a cap, I think, that he did. I think I'll give beefy, big fighting against it, found his come to Kabul, that sort of local, but Friday, which is a day off, and informal, is true. And reluctant of a true situation on the ground. As I wrote an essay, there's absolute passion. I wanted to see the country, say, 10 years from now. And the luxury that President Karzai had is so rare. No other leader would have the amount of resources he had, the amount of international support he had, yet he lacked a vision for the country. When I spoke to those closest to him, who've worked with him over the past 12 years, freedom of expression, parts of the country, but at the same time, he vision in terms of a to you who work with in the gender. That's one of the more fascinating questions. That if somebody like Hamid Karzai is not sure of his physical or political survival every day, especially if you go back to 2002, can he afford to be a visionary? And I went to Kandahar to sort of trace this story a little bit. In September 2002, on September 5th, 2002, just a few months after, when I think about it, very fragmented.
His legacy is, why weren't you a commander-in-chief? Why did you act in this way? And it's still a country, and this seemed to be delivered.
A level of tremendous advantage. No, there may have been building rock. Brahimi wanted a light footprint. They all come in, but it's quite clear that when some say he's now playing to his own audience, Afghanistan, our corruption being spent. And we have people in the world who knows from the international longest time in Afghanistan. We are very reluctant when he talked about Afghanistan, the ones he trusted, the people he met.
About your relationship. Americans first came into Afghan Americans, just like the first time in 2008 on it. As General said, the allies are either deaf or not doing enough. And if part of it is natural also, that this perception of hypocrisy that Karzai had. If somebody is in power for 12 years or so, on the other side of partnership, there's a change of administration. And obviously that comes a change of policy. But one partner is the same guy. And he perceives that change as hypocrisy rather than just a natural change. But there were episodes in private that kept triggering this anger deeper. So I'm convinced that it's no longer tactical antagonism. But I think it also goes back to what the general said, that he knows the United States far better than the United States or some of the US officials have known him. And I think it proves a point in the BSA negotiations that the US threatened with the zero option that if you don't sign this, we're going to pull out all troops. Yet several months later, we see that that hasn't happened. So he knows how far to push the US. Maybe sometimes he pushes the US too far, and it's the US's patience and not sort of jeopardizing 12 years because they know that President Karzai will be gone for pretty soon. But at the same time, I think tactically, we need to give Karzai credit that he knows how far to push them. And he's done that in the issue of BSA and the funding, military funding, and the future of sort of U.S. presence.
So, General, why were we so deaf? And you mentioned at the beginning of your talks the importance of holding up a mirror to ourselves. How responsible, or what share of the responsibility do we also have for where we are right now?
Well, I'm not sure I want to engage in an exercise of self-flagellation here, but We didn't listen to him initially, and I think we didn't listen to him because in so many ways we felt we had the answer. I think in so many ways we felt that the exigencies of the operational environment drove us to make decisions that we would perhaps under other circumstances might have been willing to listen more closely. A couple of things. He and I had a couple of conversations about the issue of sovereignty, and I think both Mujib and the ambassador hit it very clearly. It's a really important point. As time went on, and as we were very clearly facing the end of the large-scale international involvement in Afghanistan, I think the President President Karzai rightly saw that one of the most important things he could deliver, perhaps tribal or ethnic origins, and forces to be in the lead in its entirety in the context of creating a stable and safe and peaceful Afghanistan. But I also told him on a number of occasions, and this is a conversation I've actually had in a couple of places around the world, that sovereignty isn't something that exists apart from the inherent responsibility of the people seeking sovereignty to act responsibly. So sovereignty demands responsibility. And to be able to take responsibility for your actions and your words and your vision, such as of it may exist, and I actually think he was more visionary than perhaps some folks have given him credit for. It also requires capacity. And so the frustration that we had often in our conversations was, Mr. President, I absolutely do not disagree with you on any of these issues with respect to your ambitions for sovereignty. But in order for you to be truly sovereign, you have to be able to take responsibility for the actions of the system of the judiciary, or the actions of the finance ministry, or the actions of elements within the Ministry of Interior. But you can't do that unless you have capacity, and that's what we're all trying to partner to do. And if you don't like our capacity building, tell us. He frequently told me issues he didn't like. We worked very hard to try to lower civilian casualties, and frankly, we're pretty successful at that. We worked very hard at ultimately getting after the business of war profiteering and corruption associated with this. We created ultimately the Combined Joint Interagency Task Force Afghanistan, which is where we brought all the counter-corruption elements together, all the contracting elements, all the spending elements, all the threat finance elements. We brought it all together where it should have been from the very beginning. We were not properly organized. That's the first reflection that I would give you. If we were to do this again, we would have to be properly organized in the context of understanding organized criminality in the environment in which we're going to operate, understanding it clearly, and then being organized ourselves once we understand it and can see it to ensure that we don't contribute to it or don't exacerbate it in the course of the natural development and capacity building and reconstruction that would have to occur. And I'm afraid we did. And I'm afraid that we came to the conclusion far too late in the process that we needed to be organized in a task force about corruption and the denial of funds to the enemy in a manner almost as important as a maneuver task force would be. Because in the end, the Afghans were moving into the lead. What was going to win the war, ultimately, for the Afghans was less about, we also didn't, I think, in some respect, fueled the 6 months. Has clear governance responsibility.
Thank you. Say who you are.
Bill Bird with the idea that the U.S. So the question is more general. Global bank raises money, and in of being.
I know the choices that he made, especially relates to the issue of now dealt with politically rather than through the rule of law. So consensus politics. I think after the election of 2009, he was the most powerful man in the country. He could have spent the last 5 years of his administration building institutions and leaving behind strong institutions.
On the Kabul bank, I don't have any objections to what you're saying, and there's no doubt that there has been a toleration of corruption at That is unacceptable. Can I add to that one thing? In order to systematically go after corruption, you need a functioning rule of law system. It's just about the most difficult thing to build. You can build an army, tremendously difficult, again, very expensive. We really got into the environment of organized crime. Who dares to go after the real criminals? I'll give you one example from Europe. There's a place called Kosovo, as you know, which is 1.7% the size. And there were never any witnesses who dared to stand up. So it's not an uncommon phenomenon that we've seen here. When it comes to sovereignty, is it more than Karzai himself? I think it's a question of respect for the country and for building its institutions. And I do come back to what I said originally. I do not think that we have taken institution building seriously. We have spent a lot of money into capacity building. Most assessment of that capacity building, as you know better than I do, says that it hasn't worked. And in fact, sometimes even has become an obstacle to building institutions. And when finally in 2008, 2009, we managed to get in place a real civil service institute that was going to bring out thousands of people who could then go to the districts and so on. What happens? The donors don't finance it. They do finance, and I discovered now in May, they do finance a young international via a donor agency of a big Western country, was then given this contract to a contractor from the same country and finance with foreigners to be in a ministry. And this person earns $22,000 per month still. For doing what? Writing reports. Capacity substitution, not capacity building. That has been our expertise. And I do understand that he is furious about it. Because we have built institutions that are much stronger than they were before, but they could have been much stronger than they are. Can I just mention one other example? And I mentioned it to some of you before. I was sitting in my office March 2009 in Kabul. I got a message on my email. It was from Richard Boucher, then Assistant Secretary of State for the region. And he wrote to me, Kai, we will soon have a big Afghanistan conference in The Hague, and you will be asked to chair it, and Ban Ki-moon will be there. Now, that's nice to warn me about that in advance. So I thought, in due course, I'll get to know more about it. And then 45 minutes later, Associated Press carried a story from Brussels where Hillary Clinton had announced that there will be a big conference in The Hague in the end of March. Ban Ki-moon will be there. Can she even mention that this young Mr. Eide would co-chair it? Huh? So I was puzzled, and I called Foreign Minister Spanta, and I said, my friend, why haven't you told me about this conference? He said, which conference? What's this conference you're talking about? A conference about his country. And he wasn't even informed. The debate about the surge, should it be so and so many troops or so and so many troops? Was he involved? Or was he informed afterwards? He was informed afterwards about a massive increase of forces on his territory. That's what sovereignty is about. Consultation, decision-making, and not only the vanity of one individual.
Quick comment, General Allen? Or you,
No, I think that's very well put.
All right, we had a question over
Well,
here.
no, I will put one point on the capacity building. I think the overall absence of, and it's not going to happen, but the absence of a coordinating authority, the UN tried very hard, others tried very hard, but the absence of an overall coordinating authority to bring together all the international efforts really created a great difficulty, I think, ultimately for us and for Afghanistan. There is a lot that was built in Afghanistan with no tail to it, of these buildings and infrastructure facilities that Afghanistan can't afford. Afghanistan doesn't have the money. And I really had a sense of this in the period of time of the insider attacks, where I sadly had a couple of my officers killed in the Ministry of Interior. And I pulled all of my people out of the ministry, in fact, all of the ministries, ISAF people out of the ministries, until such time as we had a better feel for how badly this was going on and how far it might descend. What I didn't realize, because I'd never gone from office to office inside the Ministry of Interior, were just how many international presences, that's a plural, how much of an international presence was in that building until they all came running out when we pulled the ISAF troops out. And they had nothing to do with ISAF. They were individual national contributions. So consequently, sometimes, as the ambassador said, it worked against us. There was nearly fratricide in some respects, because we'd have a country earnestly trying to do the very best it could in investing people and money in an outcome that ISAF might have been working, or another element within the UN, or an element within NATO. And we worked against each other. So frequently we were not building the kind of capacity we wanted to, and that's what the president often honed in on, this absence of a coherent plan for capacity building. You could point to individual moments of brightness and moments of capability that emerged from it, but that's what he pointed to very frequently when he was frustrated with the international community on capacity building.
Here we are.
All right, thank you very much, USIP, and also the panels for the insight. My name is Said Zafar Hashimi from Voice of America's Afghanistan Service. I had a question for Ambassador Eide in regard to his remarks about Karzai being the consensus builder, while Afghanistan 2 weeks ago, or less than 2 weeks ago, was on the brink of a civil war and establishment of a parallel government, and it took the U.S. intervention and John Kerry's personal visit to avert the Karzai, one or two of his principles, while at the same time the president has kept.
Want to start, Kai?
John Kerry's visit. I will answer in the following way. The best solution would have been if the Afghans could have solved this themselves. Clearly, in his inauguration speech in 2009, Karzai said, "I want to Afghanize the election process." And that was after the interference trying, in fact, to unseat him at the time. Now, that didn't work. And therefore I believe that the visit by John Kerry, I admire and respect the fact that he went there, sat down with the two, and came to what for me is, I must say, the only obvious solution, at least when it comes to the counting. If you disagree on how much to count, count it all, etc. But I must say, Kerry's hands-on diplomacy in this respect is admirable. Is sometimes criticized, but I think it's admirable. In 2009, when he came and we had a problem with the second round, to have President Karzai accept the second round, he also played an extremely constructive role. I spent much of those 3 days with him. And afterwards, Karzai, I remember, said, "John Kerry is the American politician that I trust the most." So I think nobody were better placed than to do that. And through that answer, I have half answered your question, but avoided part of it.
I think the question of the First Lady has kind of intrigued me for a long time also. Her sort of absence in the public sphere. If we go back to 2002, 2003, there are some interviews of her with the local media and international media, which shows that at least back then, President Karzai wasn't against her speaking out or being publicly involved. And she had said that she wanted to be involved in sort of healthcare for women and education and those issues. what I know from her involvement now is that she does meet people, but she's not publicly involved, which is unfortunate. I think she's a very well-educated woman. She's a medical doctor. And one thing that Afghanistan has lacked has been female role models after sort of a long blackout on women in society, especially after 2002. Sort of the morale was pretty low for women to get back involved in the public sphere. So she could have been a great role model with her education, with her involvement. It's unfortunate that it hasn't happened. I don't have a clear answer, but I agree with you that it probably is being sensitive to the tribal realities and being sensitive to history. In the early part of 20th century, we had rulers who involved their wives in public politics. It didn't go so well. That was one of the reasons of sort of coups against them, basically, social coups at least. So I think he's sensitive to that, and because he's a tribal person, or he rules in a tribal manner, I think that is a factor that plays in her absence. But at the same time, what intrigues me is how she was first involved and now she's not. I really don't have an answer to that. No.
I think there's a question in the back there.
Good morning. I'm Asad Mateen from Axis Consulting. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a couple of questions for the ambassador and also for the general. General, you are a real American hero, and there's enormous respect in Afghanistan for you. I'm in Afghanistan at least once a week, once a month. And even President Karzai has a lot of respect for you. And he told me personally that you were the one, you fixed the broken diplomatic relations between Afghanistan and the United States. And also under watch, the Afghan give you credit for decreasing the civilian casualties in Afghanistan.
Thank you, sir.
The question I would have for you is, Afghans are really bothered by daily shelling of Pakistani forces on eastern province, corner of Afghanistan. And that's happening under watch of the NATO, more than 100,000 NATO soldiers being there. I wanted to know your perspective, and I'm sure that you had meetings with your counterpart in Pakistan. What was their response? And also, of course, the flow of the terrorists, including Al Qaeda, ISI, Pakistani, Afghanistan, Taliban. They've been shelling the American embassy, the ISAF headquarters. Most of the time I was there when they were doing that. And how come we were not, as an American superpower, we were not able to tell Pakistani to slow down? That's one question. The other one is for the ambassador. Ambassador, the Afghanistan people love your book. It's a great book. And again, President Karzai told me, he said in 2009, if it was not because of you, Ambassador Kai Eide, he said he would have been insane because of your assistant, Mr. Peter Albrook, and also Holbrook.
Don't mention it.
Could you tell us a little bit about that? So, what was going on in the background? In Karzai, basically, you said, what made Karzai the Karzai of today, and not the Karzai of 2008. It was just you, Albrook, and also your assistant. And of course, you were the one you were trying as a referee to just bring some peace. Karzai was very well managed before 2008 by George Bush administration. He was a fine, and we even call him a hero, the best president, the best this and that around the world. And all of a sudden, he became a zero. And the reason he was told me, I asked him, what happened? He says, because I don't get respect from this administration. And that comes back to sovereignty. I took a group of Google and YouTube to Karzai, and he was so impressed. He said, my God, those Americans are such a nice people. He says, why the American diplomats, they don't behave like Google and YouTube?
Let's get rid of that Allen guy.
Go ahead, General.
The border with Pakistan is a very, very difficult piece of terrain. Chitral, Momand, some of the either the federally administered tribal areas or the provinces on the eastern side of that frontier are very difficult. I'm going to say something about the border shelling, and I want to be very, very clear about what I'm going to say, because I do not want to appear to be diminishing the importance of dealing with it. And I know that my successor, Joe Dunford, has spent a great deal of time working between Afghanistan and Pakistan in an attempt to deal with this. Part of the shelling was a reality, some of the shelling was not. There were reports of thousands of rockets and artillery rounds coming across the border. It was creating a real panic in Kabul. And at one point, I got one of my helicopters, and the Ministry of Defense, Minister of Defense, Minister of Interior, the Director General of the NDS, and one of the leading members of the Parliament. We got in the bird and we flew to Kunar, where we met with the border troops, border forces, and then we flew over the villages that had been so badly shelled, according to reporting, and found that there was no shelling at all. There was no effect of shelling at all in these villages. No shell craters, no dead animals that we had been reported on, and so on. But that didn't mean there wasn't shelling. What we had to do was to understand the problem. And that was my point ultimately back to Kabul, back to the security forces, and back to the legislature, the parliament, was to make sure we clearly understood the problem, because what we were doing was creating a crisis for ourselves in many respects. The first was that the border trace, in case you didn't know it, actually follows 4 different border traces. You have the Durand Line, which I never mentioned in public in the palace for fear of the response that would get. You had the border trace that Afghanistan recognizes. You have the border trace that Pakistan recognizes, and you have the Soviet-era border trace. And none of those are the same. They all go back and forth. And consequently, Pakistan, no excuses being made for Pakistan here. Consequently, Pakistan frequently shelled areas they believed were within their border trace, and the rounds were landing on Afghans. And Afghans could prove that their border trace included them, and Pakistan was shelling sovereign Afghan territory. We worked very hard with both sides to try to create measures whereby if the Pakistanis saw TTP elements across the border, we would have the right of first refusal. We, being ISAF, working in close conjunction with Afghan forces, would go up and get after some of these forces. Bad reporting, bad intelligence on both sides made it much more difficult in really tough terrain to be able to solve this problem. But I think in many respects, while that was a major issue before, and it's still an issue if a single round comes flying out of Pakistan and lands in Afghanistan, it is a serious issue. I believe that much has been done to try to solve that. To the point of cross-border movement of terrorists and insurgent elements, we worked very hard with Pakistan to create an environment whereby if we could get Pakistan to take action, primarily in North Waziristan against the Haqqanis, we could solve a lot of the problems in the eastern 5 provinces, to include Kabul, of Afghanistan. Just a very sad moment was the 24th and 25th of November 2011. I'd spent a better part of a full day with General Kayani alone in his office over maps, working out the way in which we would cooperate across the border. He would drive them across the border. Large ISAF forces present, along with Afghan presence, would deal with them as they came across the border. I woke up the next morning to find out that 24 troops had been killed overnight on one of my special operations in Salalah that broke the relationship with Pakistan. They closed the ground line of communications, and we lost 9 months. 9 months of no communications whatsoever. And in the meantime, the force levels of the ISAF forces were starting to come down. And the Afghan forces weren't operating up along the border because they had bigger issues to deal with the Taliban deeper in the east and in the south. And so while we had had excellent partnership across the border in 2009 and 10, and to some extent in 2011, that partnership basically ended at the end of November of 11, didn't pick back up again until it actually still hasn't picked back up again. The other issue was we couldn't get Pakistan ultimately to attack the insurgent elements on the eastern side of the frontier that we really needed for them to go after, which was the Haqqanis. And I ran, as you may remember, it was in the media, I didn't spend a lot of time talking about it in public, but we ran a very concentrated operation against the Haqqanis called Knife Edge, where we being in partnership, Afghanistan and ISAF committed large numbers of Afghan special operators against the Haqqanis, and they really proved themselves to be quite good as troops, and it gave me a sense that we could accelerate, actually, the Afghans moving into the lead. But the cross-border coordination is a very serious issue. It's a major security issue that's going to have to be resolved over time, and that's why my concern about the comment a little earlier about we have a zero option that is playing out here by the end of 2016. You know, the new president, I think, is going to have to take a very real, clear-eyed, realistic look at what the American policy is with respect to our advisors and the period of time we'll remain in the country, and consider very seriously whether he needs to speak directly to the President of the United States about changing that policy, given the operational realities in Afghanistan. And I would certainly applaud that president, whoever he's going to be, to undertake that very measure.
In 30 seconds, what happened in 2009?
I think the way it started was, of course, that President Obama decided to discontinue the video conferences that President Bush had had regularly with President Karzai. And Bush writes in his book, I made it a point of keeping in touch with him and not teaching him, but advising. The only way to make him a real leader was to treat him as a real leader. I think that was a right approach. That was discontinued. There was also a very acrimonious debate between Vice President-elect Joe Biden just before they took over in Kabul. And then came Holbrooke. And we had a slightly troubled relationship just before I arrived. And we met at the U.S. ambassador's residence. And the first question that Richard Holbrooke asks me is, when does your contract expire?
I was actually sitting there with you, by the way. I was in that room, yeah.
And then started the hunt for somebody to run against Karzai. And when the day was over, and you had also been with Holbrooke, with Karzai, Karzai called and called me up to the palace, and we talked about the meetings. And I cannot really remember who said it. Was it him or me? But one of us said, you know, Holbrooke is after both of us. that was a feeling that was there already from the very beginning, unfortunately. And that suspicion became stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger throughout the election process, unfortunately. I had established quite a good relationship with Karzai already, because some because of civilian casualties and some other. And when he was going to choose his vice presidential candidates, he asked me to come up to the office and said, second vice president, I suggest so-and-so. And I said, but fine, you know, it's your choice. and then he said, first, I want to bring in Marshal Fahim Khan. I said, let me think about this until tomorrow. And because I was surprised. And I came back and we had 6 meetings where I tried to prevent him from doing that. I didn't succeed, obviously. And why did he want Fahim? Why did he want to bring Dastum backwards from Turkey? Because he could see that the turnout in the Pashto provinces would be low. He needed alliances in order to win the elections. Very, very simple. But at that time, I must say, I felt there was a turn in the direction of more reliance on that kind of forces and less on the reform-oriented technocrats. That was in 2009. Then, when it came to the real crunch towards the end of the election process, and I must say, Scott and I worked very closely together on this, our attitude was, let's not panic here. You know, we haven't hit the wall yet. There is something called the Constitution, and there are institutions created by the Constitution, and we must allow them to do their work, and we must try to assist them to see to it that they do their work properly. That had to be the answer, in spite of all the criticism that came from some. Then John Kerry came, and I remember during Kerry's period. This is anecdotal, if you permit. The second day Kerry was there, he was in Helmand, and I saw the president before, and I sat down in his office, and I said, Mr. President, can we go down to your small office downstairs instead of sitting in this big office, because you never know what's being listened to by whom. So we went downstairs, and I said to the president, we were sitting there. I must, quite honestly, I was red in my face, because it was a very emotional meeting. And I said to him, Mr. President, if you do not follow the Constitution and accept the second round, then I will resign as RSG. Because if the president doesn't follow the Constitution, then there is no role for me, who has insisted on following the Constitution. It was a meeting that I thought would last 10 minutes. It lasted 45 minutes. Did it have any impact? I don't know. Yeah, I think it had a personal impact, you know. There is a certain kind of intimacy between you when you can talk about these kind of things. Kerry came back. There was a long discussion. Certain things happened with certain ballot boxes. And the next day, President announced that he would go for a second round. And the rest, you know, Abdullah withdrew. The President continued for a second term. And here comes the question, because you said he had all the opportunity during his second round. I think President Karzai suffered throughout these 5 years from the fact that he never had the 50%. It never hit that mark. Therefore, I think he has felt that he did not quite have the legitimacy that the Constitution required from a president. And he blamed that on the Obama administration.
I think, Scott, could I just
Sure.
add a little bit too? I think the legitimacy question is really interesting, and you and I had a discussion about this in Kabul also. But I think in terms of public perception, one thing that I've noticed past 5 years, that Karzai was not challenged over his legitimacy. The opposition, Abdullah could have done it very easily. Or any of the opposition politicians could have challenged his legitimacy. But I think we throw that out there also, that publicly he didn't get challenged over the past 5 years. It was a personal pain to him, absolutely, but in the public discussions he wasn't challenged.
I think that brings us to the end of our time. And I think this is obviously a topic which is much bigger than 2 hours allows. But for me, the discussion, even though I've lived through some of this and seen others of it and studied others of it, has still been fascinating and revealing. So I want to thank our three panelists, and I want to thank all of you for coming and for your questions. Maybe this won't be the last time we host this kind of discussion, but I think for the first draft, it was extremely good. So thank the three of you very much. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.